Jake Morrison sat in the cold metal chair with heavy chains around his wrists and ankles. The transport ship shook as it moved through space toward a place he had only heard about in whispers. Around him sat thousands of other humans, all wearing the same gray prison clothes and the same look of fear in their eyes. The alien guards walked up and down the rows of prisoners. They were tall and covered in green scales with yellow eyes that seemed to glow in the dim light. Jake had learned to call them Zephyrians during his 3 years as a slave. These creatures had defeated Earth in a war that lasted only 6 months. Now every human alive was their property. Amy Watson sat 2 seats away from Jake. She used to fly fighter ships for Earth before the war ended. Her brown hair was cut short, and her hands showed scars from working in the metal factories on Titan. She caught Jake's eye and nodded toward the guard who was walking past them. The guard carried a small device that beeped every time it pointed at a human. "They are counting us again," Amy whispered so quietly that only Jake could hear her. Jake looked around the huge cargo hold of the ship. Row after row of humans stretched as far as he could see. Men, women, and even some children who had been born after the war. All of them were going to the same place. All of them were going to be sold. Dr. Ben Clark sat behind Jake and Amy. Before the war, he had studied alien life forms and had written books about creatures from other worlds. Now he studied their captors to find ways to stay alive. Ben was older than most of the other prisoners, and his gray hair made him look wise even in chains. "The ship will reach Nexus Prime in 2 hours, Ben said in a low voice. "I have been listening to the guards talk. This auction is different from the others." Jake turned his head slightly to hear better. "What do you mean different?" Ben leaned forward as much as his chains would allow. "They are not just selling small groups of humans this time. They are selling all of us. Every human they captured from Earth and the colonies. 50,000 people." Amy's eyes went wide. 50,000? That means they are selling our entire species. "Not selling," Ben corrected her. "Getting rid of us." "I heard 2 guards talking about how happy they will be when humans are gone forever." Jake felt his heartbeat faster. He had always known this day might come. The Zephyrians had kept humans as workers for 3 years, but they never seemed to like having them around. Humans asked too many questions and caused too much trouble. It would be easier for the aliens to just sell them all to someone else. "Do you know who is buying us?" Jake asked. Ben's face became very serious. "The Vorthak Collective. They own crystal mines on a planet far from here. Humans who go to work for the Vorthaks are never seen again." Jake had heard stories about the Vorthaks. They were creatures that looked like giant spiders but walked on 2 legs. They put small parasites into the brains of their workers to control their minds. The workers became like robots, doing exactly what they were told until they died from working too hard. The ship shook again, and Jake could see through a small window that they were getting close to something very big. Nexus Prime was a space station the size of a small moon. Ships from all over the galaxy came here to buy and sell things. Today they would be buying humans. Amy looked at Jake with determination in her eyes. "We cannot just sit here and let this happen." "What can we do?" Jake asked. "We are chained up and surrounded by guards." Amy smiled in a way that made Jake think she had been planning something. "Ben has been teaching me about the different alien species. Did you know that Vorthaks cannot control the minds of every creature? Some species are immune to their parasites." Ben nodded. "It is true. I have been studying this for months. The Vorthak parasites work by attaching to specific brain chemicals. Humans have a different brain structure than most species. The parasites might not work on us at all." Jake felt hope for the first time in months. "Are you saying that if the Vorthaks buy us, they will not be able to control our minds?" "That is exactly what I am saying," Ben replied. "They think they are buying slaves who will do whatever they want. But they might be buying an army that can think for itself." The ship began to slow down, and Jake could see the massive docking bays of Nexus Prime getting closer. Hundreds of ships were already there. Ships from every corner of the galaxy. All of them had come to watch humans being sold like animals. A loud voice spoke through speakers in the ceiling. It was speaking in the alien language that Jake had learned to understand during his years as a slave. The voice said that all prisoners should prepare for transport to the auction house. The guards began moving down the rows of humans, checking their chains and making sure everyone was ready to leave the ship. Jake, Amy, and Ben exchanged one last look. They all knew that whatever happened next would decide the future of every human still alive. Remember, Ben whispered as the guards got closer. Let them think we are just dumb animals. Let them think we do not understand what is happening. The longer they believe that, the better our chances will be. Jake nodded. For 3 years, humans had been treated like property. Today they would be sold like property. But if Ben was right about the Vorthak parasites, then maybe being sold was exactly what they needed. Maybe the aliens were about to make the biggest mistake in galactic history. The guards reached their row and began unlocking their chains from the chairs. Jake stood up slowly, acting scared and confused like all the other humans around him. But inside, he was already planning. If the Vorthaks could not control human minds, then humans could plan their own escape. And if humans could escape, they could fight back. The auction was about to begin, and Jake Morrison was ready to make sure it would be the last auction in galactic history. The auction house was bigger than any building Jake had ever seen on Earth. The ceiling was so high that he could barely see it in the dim light above. Thousands of alien creatures sat in seats that went up and up like a mountain made of metal and stone. At the center of it all was a stage where Jake now stood with Amy and Ben. The auctioneer was a creature called a Krell. His name was Vextar, and he was 3 times taller than any human. His skin was purple and covered with bumps that changed color when he spoke. His voice was so loud that it hurt Jake's ears even though he was standing far away from him. Today we sell the last of the human species, Vextar announced to the crowd. 50,000 workers who have proven their worth in our factories and mines. They are strong, they learn quickly, and they do not get sick easily. Jake looked out at the crowd and saw creatures he had never imagined could exist. Some looked like giant insects with too many arms and legs. Others were made of what appeared to be living crystal that sparkled in the light. There were creatures that floated in the air without wings and others that seemed to be made of metal and circuits. Amy stood next to Jake trying to look afraid, but he could see in her eyes that she was counting the guards and looking for exits. Ben was doing something different. He was watching the aliens in the crowd and studying how they acted toward each other. The bidding started right away. A group of insect creatures called the HFY swarm made the first offer. Their speaker clicked and buzzed in a way that hurt to listen to. The translation device hanging from the ceiling turned their sounds into words that everyone could understand. 500,000 galactic credits for the human workers. The HFY speaker announced. Jake felt his stomach turn. He was listening to aliens talk about buying his entire species like they were discussing the price of farm animals. But he forced himself to stay calm and keep listening. The Zephyrians who had captured Earth made the next bid. 750,000 credits, their representative called out. Jake recognized the voice. It belonged to Commander Zexhai, the same alien who had demanded Earth's surrender 3 years ago. But then something strange happened. A new voice spoke from the crowd, and when Jake heard it, he felt afraid in a way he had not felt since the war ended. The voice was deep and wet, like someone speaking through thick mud. 1.2 million galactic credits, the voice said. Jake looked toward where the voice had come from and saw the Vorthak representative for the first time. Commander Thexel was even more terrifying than the stories had made him sound. He looked like a giant spider that had learned to walk on 2 legs. His skin was black and shiny, and when he moved, Jake could hear his joints making clicking sounds. What happened next made Jake realize that Ben had been right about everything. As soon as Thexel made his bid, the other aliens stopped bidding. The HFY swarm representative sat back in his seat. The Zephyrians became quiet. Even species that Jake had expected to bid for human workers suddenly acted like they were not interested anymore. Amy noticed it too. She moved closer to Jake and whispered, "This is wrong. Look at how they are all acting." Jake watched as signals passed between Vextar the auctioneer and Thexel the Vorthak commander. They were small signals that most people would not notice. A slight nod here, a gesture there. But to Jake, who had spent years watching guards communicate in secret, it was obvious that they had planned this ahead of time. Ben leaned forward slightly and spoke so quietly that only Jake and Amy could hear him. "The auction is fake. They already decided who would buy us before we even got here." "But why make it look like an auction?" Amy asked. "Because they need to make it legal," Ben replied. "Galactic law says that all slave sales must be done in public auctions, but they can still control who wins." Jake watched as other alien species made fake bids that were much lower than Thexel's offer. It was all for show. Everyone in the crowd knew that humans were going to the Vortex no matter what happened. The bidding continued for another hour, but it was just theater. Thexel would make a bid and then wait for other species to make smaller bids before raising his offer again. Finally, Vextar announced that the Vorthak Collective had won with a bid of 2 million galactic credits. Sold to Commander Thexel of the Vorthak Collective, Vextar declared. The human species now belongs to you. The crowd began to cheer, but Jake was not paying attention to them anymore. He was thinking about what Ben had told him about the Vorthak parasites and whether they would really be unable to control human minds. If Ben was wrong, then every human would be dead within a year. If Ben was right, then the Vorthaks had just bought their own destruction. Jake looked at Amy and Ben one more time. They both nodded slightly to show they were ready for what came next. During their years as slaves, they had learned to communicate without words. They had also learned to hide things from their captors. Jake reached into his mouth and pressed his tongue against a tooth that felt different from the others. Hidden inside that fake tooth was a small device that Ben had built using scraps from the factory where they had worked. The device contained information that could change everything. But first, Jake had to do something that would shock every alien in the auction house. He had to let them know that humans understood every word they had been saying. Jake stood up as straight as his chains would allow. He looked directly at Vextar the auctioneer and spoke in perfect galactic standard, the language that humans were supposed to be too stupid to learn. The bid is accepted, Jake said in a voice that carried across the entire auction house. But the merchandise comes with terms of sale that the buyer has not read. The auction house became completely silent. Every alien creature stopped moving and stared at Jake in shock. For 3 years, they had believed that humans were just smart animals, who could follow simple orders but could not really think or speak their language. Vextar's purple skin turned bright red with surprise. The human spoke in galactic standard. How is this possible? Commander Thexel rose from his seat, his spider-like legs making loud clicking sounds on the metal floor. It does not matter what language the animal speaks. I have bought them and they belong to me now. Jake smiled for the first time since the war ended. That is where you are wrong, Commander. We belong to no one, and we are about to prove it. The moment Jake spoke in galactic standard, chaos exploded throughout the auction house. Alien guards rushed toward the stage while creatures in the crowd stood up and began shouting in dozens of different languages. Security alarms started blaring and red lights flashed from every wall, but Jake was not finished. He pressed his tongue against the fake tooth again and felt the small device pop out into his mouth. He caught it with his teeth and bit down hard. The device cracked open and released a bitter liquid that he swallowed quickly. Amy and Ben saw what Jake had done and they did the same thing. All 3 humans had been carrying the same hidden device for months, waiting for exactly this moment. The bitter liquid was Dr. Ben Clark's greatest creation, a formula that would make their blood toxic to Vorthak parasites. Restrain the humans immediately, Commander Thexel ordered as his spider-like legs carried him quickly toward the stage. But before the guards could reach them, something incredible happened. Every human in the auction house stood up at the same time. Not just Jake, Amy, and Ben, but all 50,000 humans who had been brought to Nexus Prime for the sale. The aliens had made a terrible mistake. They had brought all the humans to the same place at the same time, thinking it would make the auction more impressive. What they had actually done was give humanity its first chance to act as one people since the war ended. Jake pulled the data device from his mouth and held it up for everyone to see. This contains legal documents prepared according to Galactic Commerce Code 847, he announced. Any sentient species sold at public auction has the right to invoke terms of conditional service if they can prove legal knowledge and intelligence. Vextar the auctioneer stopped moving toward them. His purple skin was now flashing between red and yellow, which Jake had learned meant that Krells were either very angry or very confused. That law has not been used in over 200 years. That is because no slave species has ever been smart enough to use it, Ben said as he stepped forward. But humans have been studying your laws for 3 years. We know exactly what rights we have. Amy moved to stand beside Ben and Jake. We demand immediate legal representation and a formal review of this sale. Under Section 12 of the Galactic Commerce Regulations, the crowd of aliens became even more confused. They had come to watch the final sale of humanity, but instead they were watching humans quote legal codes and demand their rights. This had never happened before in the history of the galaxy. Commander Thexel was furious. His black spider body was shaking with anger, and his voice became even deeper and wetter than before. I do not care what laws you quote. I have paid 2 million credits and you belong to me now. Jake looked directly at the Vorthak commander. You bought workers, not slaves. According to the terms of conditional service, we must be provided with proper living conditions, limited work hours, safety equipment, and most importantly, the right to earn our freedom through productivity quotas. This is impossible, Thexel said. No slave species has ever invoked conditional service terms. We are not a slave species, Amy replied. We are an employed species, and as employees we have rights that you must respect. Ben stepped forward and pulled out another device that he had hidden in his shoe. This one was bigger and more complex than the tooth devices. This contains a complete legal brief of 500 pages detailing our rights under galactic law. It also contains productivity standards that we will meet in exchange for our eventual freedom. The auction house was becoming more chaotic by the minute. Representatives from other species began shouting that their own slave workers should have the same rights. The Galactic Commerce Authority officials who had been watching the auction were now talking frantically among themselves. An official in a bright blue uniform stepped onto the stage. He was a member of the Altarian Council, the species that controlled most galactic trade laws. This auction must be stopped until these legal claims can be reviewed. No, Commander Thexel said. I have already paid for these humans. The transaction is complete. The Altarian official looked at the documents that Ben was holding. If these humans can prove that they understand galactic law and can function as legal entities, then the sale terms must be modified according to Code 847. Jake could see that their plan was working. For 3 years, humans had pretended to be simple-minded workers who could barely understand basic commands, but they had actually been learning everything they could about galactic law, alien technology, and the weaknesses of their captors. More importantly, they had been preparing for this exact moment. Ben had not just created the anti-parasite formula that they had swallowed. He had also created something much more dangerous to the Vorthaks. There is one more thing, Ben announced as he held up a third device. This contains the chemical formula for a compound that neutralizes Vorthak mind control parasites. Not just for humans, but for all species. The effect of Ben's words was immediate. Every alien in the crowd that had ever been controlled by Vorthak parasites began talking at once. Species that had been enslaved by the Vorthaks for hundreds of years suddenly realized that freedom might be possible. Commander Thexel moved toward Ben with his legs clicking dangerously. You will give me that device immediately. I do not think so, Ben replied calmly. As an employee of the Vorthak Collective, I have the right to keep my personal research private unless it interferes with my assigned work duties. Jake watched as understanding slowly spread across Commander Thexel's face. The Vorthaks had thought they were buying 50,000 obedient workers. Instead, they had just hired 50,000 humans who knew their greatest weakness and had the ability to destroy their entire empire. The Altarian official was reading through Ben's legal documents with growing amazement. These terms are legally binding according to galactic commerce law. The Vorthak Collective must accept human employees rather than human slaves. And as employees, Amy added with a smile, we have the right to organize, to communicate with other workers, and to share technical knowledge that might improve working conditions. Commander Thexel realized too late what had happened. He had been so eager to buy humanity that he had not considered what would happen if humans turned out to be smarter than anyone believed. Now he was legally required to take 50,000 humans to his mining worlds, give them reasonable working conditions, and allow them to earn their freedom. But what made it even worse for the Vorthaks was that these humans carried the knowledge to free every slave in their empire. And according to galactic law, there was nothing he could do to stop them. The sale is legally modified, the Altarian official announced. Humanity is now employed by the Vorthak Collective under terms of conditional service. Transport will begin immediately. Jake looked out at the crowd of confused and angry aliens. In one day, humanity had gone from being a slave species to being an employed species with legal rights. But more than that, they had just planted the seeds for the largest slave rebellion in galactic history. The auction was over, but the real fight was just beginning. The fake escape had worked perfectly. Amy and 12 other humans had tried to steal a Vorthak transport ship and leave Kepler 442b. They were captured exactly as planned, and the Vorthak overseers believed they had stopped the human rebellion before it could grow. While the Vorthaks celebrated their victory, Dr. Ben Clark finished building the most important device in galactic history. Jake stood in the main crystal processing center, looking at the massive machine that Ben had secretly modified over the past 2 months. To the Vorthaks, it looked like a normal crystal refinery that turned raw ore into pure energy crystals. But Ben had turned it into a broadcasting system that could send his anti-parasite formula to every controlled mind in the galaxy. "Are you ready?" Ben asked as he made final adjustments to the machine's crystal matrix. Jake nodded and activated the communication system that connected all the liberated workers across the planet. "All teams, this is Jake Morrison. Operation Freedom begins now." The response was immediate. Across Kepler 442b, workers from dozens of species began moving toward their assigned targets. The Kretal fighters that Amy had trained moved to capture the communication centers. The Siltian teams used their ability to breathe underwater to take control of the planet's water processing systems. Human engineers began shutting down the orbital defense platforms that protected the planet from attack. But the most important target was the main control center where the Vorthak commanders coordinated their empire. Jake led a team of 20 liberated workers through the underground tunnels toward the heavily guarded facility. The Vorthaks were completely surprised. For 6 months, they had believed that their workers were loyal and obedient. They never suspected that thousands of their slaves had regained their free will and were working together to destroy the empire from within. Jake's team reached the control center just as Ben activated his modified crystal refinery. The machine began humming with power as it converted raw crystals into pure energy and broadcast Ben's anti-parasite formula across the galaxy. The signal would take hours to reach every controlled world, but once it did, billions of beings would remember what freedom felt like. "Surrender now and you will not be harmed," Jake called out to the Vorthak guards as his team surrounded the control center. The lead guard, a massive spider creature named Overseer Kextal, laughed with a sound like breaking glass. "You think a few escaped slaves can defeat the Vorthak Empire? We control half the galaxy." "Not anymore," Jake replied as he activated a communication device that Ben had given him. "Ben, start the broadcast." Across the planet, Ben's modified crystal refinery sent its signal into space at the speed of light. The anti-parasite formula raced toward every world under Vorthak control, carrying with it the promise of freedom for countless enslaved beings. But then something happened that even Jake had not expected. Warning alarms began sounding throughout the control center, and Overseer Kextal's confident expression changed to one of fear. "Impossible," Kextal said as he stared at the communication displays. "There are ships approaching the system. Human ships." Jake felt his heart race as he looked at the displays. Dozens of ships were emerging from hyperspace around Kepler 442b, and they were all flying the blue and white flag of Earth. Ships that everyone believed had been destroyed 3 years ago were suddenly appearing like ghosts, returning to life. The largest ship in the fleet opened a communication channel that reached every corner of the planet. A woman's voice spoke with the authority of someone who had never surrendered, even when surrender seemed like the only option. "This is Admiral Lisa Hayes of the Earth Liberation Fleet. We have come to collect our people." Jake could barely believe what he was hearing. Admiral Hayes had been Earth's greatest military leader before the war. Everyone thought she had died when the Zephyrians destroyed Earth's space fleet. But somehow she had survived, and somehow she had been building a new fleet in secret. The space battle that followed was brief, but decisive. The human ships had been built using technology stolen from a dozen different alien species over the past 3 years. More importantly, they were crewed by humans who refused to give up. No matter how impossible the odds seemed, the Vorthak defense fleet tried to fight back. But their ships were designed to intimidate enslaved populations, not to fight against determined enemies. Within an hour, the orbital space around Kepler 442b belonged to humanity once again. But the real victory was happening across the galaxy, as Ben's anti-parasite formula reached world after world. On planets that had been under Vorthak control for centuries, entire populations suddenly remembered their real names and their desire to be free. The Zephyrian Empire began to collapse as their own people realized they had been controlled by parasites. The Hivari swarm dissolved as individual hives reclaimed their independence. Jake stood in the captured control center, watching displays that showed rebellions starting on hundreds of worlds. In just a few hours, the galaxy had changed from a place where powerful species enslaved weaker ones to a place where every being had the chance to choose their own future. Admiral Hayes landed on Kepler 442b and met with Jake in the control center. She was older than Jake had expected, with gray hair and scars that told the story of 3 years spent fighting a war that everyone else thought was over. "You did well, Captain Morrison," Admiral Hayes said. "Earth Command received reports of your resistance activities months ago. We timed our attack to support your rebellion." Jake looked around the control center where liberated workers from dozens of species were working together to coordinate freedom movements across the galaxy. "What happens now, Admiral?" Admiral Hayes smiled. "Now we rebuild, not just Earth but the entire galaxy. We create a system where no species can enslave another, where no auction can determine the fate of entire civilizations." 1 year later, Jake stood in the meeting hall of the new Galactic Assembly on Earth. Representatives from hundreds of liberated worlds had come together to create a government based on freedom rather than power. Species that had been enemies for thousands of years were working together to solve problems that affected everyone. Jake had been elected as Earth's representative to the Assembly, but his first speech was not about humanity's victory. It was about the future that all species could build together. "The auction was rigged," Jake said to the assembled representatives. "The Vorthax and Zephyrians thought they could decide our fate by selling us like animals. But they made a mistake that changed everything. They brought us all together in one place, and they gave us the chance to remember that we are stronger together than we ever were apart." The applause that followed came from creatures of every shape and size imaginable. Beings that had once been enslaved were now free to choose their own paths. The galaxy would never again be a place where the strong could simply take what they wanted from the weak. Jake looked out at the assembly and saw the future that humanity had fought for. It was not a future where humans ruled over other species. It was a future where every being had the right to be free, and where freedom was something that had to be earned and protected by everyone working together. The auction had been rigged, but humanity had won something more valuable than their own freedom. They had won the chance to build a galaxy where freedom belonged to everyone. 6 months had passed since the auction, and the crystal mines of Kepler 442b were running better than they ever had before. The Vorthak overseers were pleased with their human employees who worked harder and faster than any previous workers. What the Vorthaks did not know was that the humans were working so well because they had a plan. Jake Morrison stood at the entrance to Mineshaft 7, watching as workers from a dozen different species carried crystal ore toward the processing centers. The planet was hot and dusty, with 3 red suns that made the sky look like it was always on fire. But Jake had learned to love this place because it was here that humanity would win its freedom. Amy Watson emerged from the mine shaft covered in purple dust from the crystals. She had been training a group of Cretal workers in what she called safety procedures, but Jake knew she was really teaching them how to fight. The Cretal looked like giant grasshoppers with 4 arms, and they had been slaves of the Vorthax for over 200 years. "How many today?" Jake asked as Amy approached him. 12 more Cretal and 8 Siltians, Amy replied. "The Siltians are natural fighters once they remember how to think for themselves." The Siltians were amphibious creatures that could breathe both air and water. They had been enslaved so long that most of them had forgotten their real names, and only answered to the numbers that the Vorthax had given them. But Dr. Ben Clark's anti-parasite formula was helping them remember who they used to be. Ben himself was working in the deepest part of the mines, in areas where the Vorthak overseers rarely went. He had found that certain crystals could be ground up and mixed with water to create more of his anti-parasite formula. Every day he made more of the formula, and every day more enslaved workers regained their free will. "Ben wants to see you in Laboratory 3, Amy said.
He says he has found something important. Jake made his way through the underground tunnels that connected all the mining operations.
The tunnels were carved from solid rock and lit by glowing crystals that the workers had installed. The Vorthax thought the lights were just to help workers see better, but they were actually part of a communication system that Ben had designed. Laboratory 3 was a small cave that Ben had converted into a research facility, using equipment that he had built from mining tools and crystal processing machinery. When Jake arrived, he found Ben hunched over a table covered with papers and electronic devices. Jake, you need to see this, Ben said without looking up from his work. I have been analyzing the crystals that we mine here, and they are not just valuable for making jewelry and computer circuits. Jake looked at the papers on Ben's table. They were covered with chemical formulas and diagrams that he did not understand. What else are they used for? Ben pointed to a particular diagram. These crystals are the main component in Vorthak mind control devices. Not just the parasites they put in workers' brains, but the large-scale mind control systems they use on entire planets. Jake felt his stomach drop. Are you saying that we are mining the materials for our own enslavement? Worse than that, Ben replied. I have been monitoring Vorthak communications, and they are using these crystals to control the populations of hundreds of worlds. Free worlds, Jake. Planets that think they are independent but are actually under Vorthak mental control. Jake sat down heavily on a box of mining equipment. How many people are under their control? Billions, Ben said. Maybe trillions. The Vorthaks have been secretly controlling most of the galaxy for centuries. The auction where we were sold was just a small part of their operation. But then Ben smiled in a way that made Jake feel hopeful again. However, I have also figured out how to turn these crystals against them. If we can modify the mining equipment in the right way, we can use it to broadcast my anti-parasite formula directly into the minds of every controlled being in the galaxy. Jake stood up quickly. Can you really do that? I have already started, Ben replied. But I need more time and I need the help of workers from other species. Each species has a slightly different brain structure, so the formula needs to be adjusted for each one. Jake thought about Amy's training sessions and the growing number of workers who were remembering how to think freely. How long do you need? 2 more months, Ben said. But there is a problem. The Vorthaks are starting to notice that their workers are acting differently. Some of the overseers have been asking questions about why productivity is so high and why workers seem more alert than usual. Jake had been worried about this too. The humans had been careful to meet all their work quotas while building their secret resistance, but it was getting harder to hide what they were doing. More and more workers were regaining their memories and their desire for freedom, and some of them were not good at pretending to still be controlled. We need a distraction, Jake said. Something to keep the Vorthak overseers busy while you finish your work. Amy appeared in the entrance to the laboratory. Did someone say distraction? Because I have an idea. Jake and Ben turned to look at her. Amy had a smile on her face that usually meant she was planning something dangerous. The Vorthaks have been expecting us to try to escape, Amy said, so let us give them what they expect. We stage a fake escape attempt that fails, making them think they have stopped our rebellion before it really starts. Ben looked worried. That sounds very risky. What if they punish all the workers for the escape attempt? They will not, Amy replied. According to our employment contracts, they can only punish workers who are directly involved in breaking the rules. If only a few humans try to escape and fail, the Vorthaks will think they have solved their problem. Jake saw the brilliance in Amy's plan, and while they are focused on preventing more escapes, they will not notice that you are preparing to free the entire galaxy. Exactly, Amy said. But we need to make the escape attempt look real. Some of us will have to actually try to leave the planet, knowing that we will be captured. Jake knew immediately who would lead the fake escape. I will do it. As the leader of the human workers, the Vorthaks will expect me to be the one trying to escape. No, Amy said firmly. You are too important to risk. I will lead the escape team. Ben looked back and forth between his 2 friends. This is very dangerous. If the Vorthaks suspect that the escape is fake, they might punish everyone. Jake thought about it carefully. The plan was risky, but it might be their only chance to give Ben the time he needed to finish his work. And if Ben succeeded, every enslaved being in the galaxy would be free. We do it, Jake decided. Amy leads a team of volunteers in a fake escape attempt. Ben continues working on the galactic broadcast system, and I keep the other workers organized and ready for when the real revolution begins. Amy nodded. I will start selecting volunteers tonight. We make our move in 1 week. Ben turned back to his equipment. That should give me enough time to finish the modifications to the crystal broadcasting system. Jake looked around the small laboratory that had become the center of their rebellion. In just 6 months, a group of enslaved humans had become the leaders of a galactic resistance movement. The Vorthaks thought they had bought workers to dig crystals from their mines. Instead, they had brought home the people who would destroy their empire and free every slave in the galaxy. The mining revolution was about to begin, and humanity would lead the way to freedom for all.